Hello, and welcome to Podcasting for Small Business. This is our companion podcast to Podcasting for Small Business, the essential blueprint to launch your podcast. I'm Sidney-Smith, and I'm joined by my co author today, Steve Orr. How are you doing, Steve?
Ray, each and every time we do an episode, I get more excited. Is that possible?
I think it is. I think it is. So welcome, of course, to all of you who are joining us live, but also listening here to the podcast afterward. In this episode, we're going to actually be jumping into chapter 4. This is episode 4, and we're loosely following along with the book chapter kind of table of contents. And so this is going to be chapter 4, how to host a podcast. Of course, hosting isn't just talking into the microphone. It's about finding your voice, calming your nerves, right? There could be all these feelings that come up when it comes to being behind the mic and sometimes in front of an audience and showing up prepared, of course. These are all elements of being able to make sure that we are podcasting in a way that brings our best self forward. And of course, one of those big key elements is making sure we choose a format that actually works for our audience. As business owners, we're trying to get in front of the right people. So we're going to break all that down today. We're going to talk about how you can host and be a more confident business owner by hosting effectively, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But also, just increasing credibility, increasing your engagement, and so this is something that is near and dear to Steve's heart because it's his work is helping people become better communicators. So, Steve, take us away. Take it away. Let's start into segment 1 and really what we're going to be talking about today.
So, one of the first things that, I want people to think about is that hosting is not just talking, it's shaping the sound, the feel, and the value of your show. And in the book, we talk about three key elements that you need to help you become a better host. The first is reflect, then it's learn and listen. And one of the reasons that I felt it was incredibly important to put this in the book, and I know Ray, we had some discussions about this, but why I felt it was very important to put this in the book is because not everybody is thinking about this as a business owner when it comes to reaching your audience. And I'll get into the reflect, learn, and listen in a moment. But Ray, um, when we had these discussions, I think initially when you were envisioning the book, this wasn't necessarily a key part of the book for you.
No, not necessarily. And I think this just comes back to my history of teaching the class. And so I was just teaching it from the perspective that I presumed, wrongly, most likely, that business owners had something to say and they were just going to say it in their own voice and be done with it. And to some extent, I wouldn't say that. I say that that's true. I mean, that's what most are doing. I think that what your point was in our discussions was that they could do better. And I think that's also very true. And so it was a natural kind of evolution for me to say, you know what, let's include this based on your work and your argument that this would actually make sense. Because yeah, there are a lot of business owners who maybe think they know how to present well and perhaps are not doing so, and this is an opportunity for them to kick the tires on how to be a host on a podcast. I think that's true.
So I think one of the biggest misconceptions that I find in my work is, and it goes to the value of preparation. And we'll talk about reflect, learn, and listen in a moment. But it's the preparation part of all of this that I think a lot of you worry that, well, if I prepare, if I do this, if I do that, I'm not going to be authentic. I'm going to ruin my spontaneity. And I have the exact opposite opinion of this. And that's one of the major reasons why I wanted this kind of information in the book. So let's talk about reflect for a moment. When I talk about reflect, I'm talking about your hosting style. And are you kind of a funny person? Are you edgy? Do you want to be that that authoritarian who knocks people over the head with the information? So all of that goes back to your style. Learn, and this goes to the preparation part. The learn part, I think, is incredibly important in terms of your preparation. And it goes to the learning of who is your guest going to be, learning as much as you can about your guest, and at the same time, making sure you're incredibly knowledgeable about the subject matter. Things can change between when you first envision your episode and when the episode comes out. Let me give you an example of that. Let's say you're doing an episode and it's tied to perhaps a news event, and you're thinking about it from a month ago, and there's been a development in that whatever it is that you're thinking about between when you first envisioned the episode and you have the episode, yet you don't really talk about that in your episode. You are not going to be timely for your episode. If that's again, that's if that's the way that you want to run your show. But just something to think about in terms of your preparation from that perspective. And the final part of this is the listen part. That is an incredibly difficult thing for many of you to envision. You think you're listening, and if you're going to be hosting a podcast, you're going to have a list of questions. Are you going to be following that list, or are you going to be listening to who your guest is? And I think that becomes problematic for folks who want to get all their questions in. It doesn't necessarily have to work that way. Listen, you never know where if you have an interview show, I should mention this, but it you never know where you're going to go potentially. And it might be
Yeah,
even a better episode if you go off ramp with some of your questions.
yeah, I think there is a bit of art and science to this, and I think the art piece of this is going with the flow. If a conversation is going well, don't stop it, just because you had a list of questions. At the same time, for some business owners, it's really helpful to have structure and to follow that structure, because if you do go off the rails, perhaps you're going to ask the wrong questions, you're going to go into the wrong topics, you're not going to stay on brand message for your own business and then you're going to go off brand message for them and what they're trying to communicate. So really, I mean, take to heart what Steve is talking about here. This is the planning and preparation of knowing yourself, right? If you know, as I want to do, if you don't give me an agenda, we're going to town. we're going to talk about lawnmowers, as Steve seems to like to talk about all of a sudden, and we're gonna talk about Socrates and Plato. We're going to talk about my interest in acrylic painting right now. We're going to go into all kinds of weird permutations and derivations and little nooks and crannies, and that's not always helpful. And so knowing myself, I know I just need to follow a basic outline. I don't need a very detailed outline. And that's because I like to do my homework in terms of getting to know who I'm going to be interviewing very well. I'm going to listen to interviews. I'm going to have read what they've written. I'm going to have ingested, if they have a book, I'm going to ingest the book, and so when I show up, I'm going to have already known all of that stuff. And so my brain has already now come up with all of the things I want to find, which are again like the pieces between everything they've already said on other podcasts. It's going to be the questions that I've probably prepared and sent to them also, but I'm trying to gain something new out of the interview and conversation with them. And that's my goal. It doesn't have to be your goal. But I think what you're talking about here, Steve, is people just getting to know what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, and doing their best as a podcast host to work around those things.
And, in terms of that preparation, I've been talking about, the listen part, but the listen part can also be listen to who, getting back to what you said a moment ago, kind of listen to who you are. And let's say that is, you're going to be a solo host. You still need to do that same kind of preparation. There still needs to be a certain amount of listening. So, but that's more an internal listening. Listen to yourself and listen to how you well, we'll get into that too as well, like how you sound. Is your pacing good? Do you have vocal inflection? Some of those kinds of issues that may be even more prominent when you're a solo host because you're not, you know, giving someone else kind of the floor and helping them shine during an episode if it is an interview, or even if you have a co-host. Like, I always want you to shine, Ray, you know, in in these. I want you to go on your soapboxes, whereas I'm the more quiet, contained one in these episodes. But no, but it's
That's
knowing,
fair.
but
That's
again,
fair.
it's knowing who you are and how and just, but a lot of people don't necessarily think about that. A lot of you say, oh, I'm just going to go, not give it any thought. And I
Yeah, and
want to
I think
protect against that.
yeah, and I think there's something also really important that you listening to yourself needs to be in the shoes of your audience, not in your shoes, because you may sound to yourself normative because you're used to hearing yourself. And you might even think of yourself as being like incredibly engaging and interesting. And then someone else watching you will be thinking that you're incredibly boring and drolling, right? And so and that's not I'm not trying not to fault anyone, but be realistic about this, right? If you are used to talking about some kind of esoteric topic and you speak in a fairly monotone voice in maybe a deep bass, you're going to put me to sleep, and so we need some, and you'll talk about this, Steve, in terms of vocal variety and just making sure that all of the things there that make a voice sound engaging and interesting come out in the mic. And it's something that I've naturally built over years. So it's not something that I never, again, I came from being a presenter and being someone who had to be in front of an audience. So I was always best when I positioned myself behind the mic as talking to an audience. And so I'm just very comfortable, that if I'm thinking about it right now, I'm talking to you, I know that we have a live audience watching, then I'm just, even if we didn't, right, I'm gonna always do the recording as though there were. And that means we're just going with it, right? We're going with the flow. And I feel like that brings a different version of myself to the recording, one in which I think I bring my best self in terms of both vocal variety, but also the nature of knowing what I'm talking about needs to be logical. I need to speak in threes. I need to be able to follow the flow of conversation and where we're going, and I need to be thinking two or three steps ahead so I know, what, this is right about the time when we should move on to our next segment.
So are you saying now's the time? But before we move on to that next segment, I do want to underline one thing that you said and make that perfectly clear is that when you're the host, you're not talking about what matters to you most. You have to think about the audience first and foremost. And we have mentioned this in past episodes, but it bears repeating. The audience always will want to know what's in it for them. And if you don't give them something that they're going to be interested in, you're not going to ultimately satisfy them. And that's going to, reverberate back onto your podcast. And it's not going to be a satisfying podcast for you when you find out what's happening with who's reacting to it, whether you're going to draw any clients, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And
So
this is
always think about that.
Yeah, and this is the defining line between podcasting for small business and what we're talking about, and podcasting for anyone else. If you're a hobbyist, if you want to be an influencer and you want to put out a podcast about, left-handed crocheting, in the middle of the Saharan desert, have fun. Go at it. You can talk into the abyss and have a great time doing it. It's passion, it's great. But if you're a business owner, especially a small business owner, you've got to basically utilize your resources to the best effect. And podcasting to an audience that doesn't care about what you're talking about is a waste of both people's times, right? Yours and the listeners. And so I can't impress upon you enough about what Steve is saying there, which is that make sure you care about what the audience cares about. and say those things, right? And that's not pandering, right? It's not
No.
about pandering. It's about saying things of value that are going to make sure they understand that what you say is important. It's subject matter expertise, it's experience, lived or professional, and it's thought leadership in the sense that it's going to bring them closer to understanding you and your value that you can bring to them as a business.
And one other thing I wanted to bring up here too that we had not touched on is in this chapter, we kind of allude to the fact that there are other skills that you can build through podcasting, which don't necessarily translate to the podcast itself, but translate to the rest of you as a business person going forward in terms of how you can build your business. And I know that was one thing that you wanted to make sure that we got into this chapter. So I will let you address those issues that I'm referring to.
Well, my catchphrase seems to be rising tide lifts all ships. And I think that certainly happens when it comes to podcast hosting. That if you become the host of your podcast, whether that's solo with a host in interviews and otherwise, you are going to become better at presenting yourself. And it's just going to be, very simple things like, you know what, I should probably do a little something with my hair before we go live, to making sure that you are bringing the right voice, right? So this is in the preparation guide that we provide in our resources library about making sure that you're not drinking soda or really sugary drinks before you get on the mic, because then you're going to be, doing the phlegmy thing. You're gonna potentially be burping or coughing from all of those kinds of things. Once you start to think about that, you're like, you know what, I shouldn't do that before I go into a business meeting, because then I'm going to be doing the same things. And so now you can get yourself just a bottle of water. You can keep yourself hydrated while still not having all of those issues that you had or could have behind the mic, but now you're doing that in person. Or just thinking about how do you best communicate when you're in a meeting with a client. Well, guess what? There are a lot of the same things that you would be doing to prepare mentally to thoughtfully communicate a message, now can be translated to a sales meeting or to a presentation that you're giving in public. All of those things work together. They kind of work in synchrony in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I do want to mention don't talk about the hair, Ray. Some of us don't have much. But no, seriously, getting back to that though, but in terms of how you're going to improve your skills in those one-on-one meetings with clients, potential clients, podcasting, if you are hosting, gives you that practice. It helps improve your research skills. It helps improve your basically your talking skills. You're going to be a better, as you mentioned, a better presenter by just the practice. You know the whole joke about practice, practice, practice. That's what gets you to Carnegie Hall. It's true as a podcast host. And it's also true, it can be true when you're presenting before potential clients or even to your clients. All that can improve with the experiences that you have as a podcast host. So
So
keep that
let's
in mind.
let's now segue into our next segment here, which is talking about some of the challenges and obstacles that hosts actually face. So, what are those things that you typically see people challenged by, and maybe some thoughts in terms of how they should work on that?
One of the biggest problems, I think, for many of you is just if you're not used to talking in front of people or in front of a microphone, it's just the nerves. People a lot of a lot of you get nervous talking in front of a microphone. So what I try to tell you, the biggest thing for me to think about is to think of this as a conversation. Think of it as a one-on-one conversation. If you're a solo host, think of it as a one-on-one conversation with your audience. If you're co-hosting, it's a one-on-one conversation with your co-host. If it's a guest, you're having a one-on-one conversation with your guest. So have it and think about it as a conversation rather than a performance. Too many too many of you are concerned that, oh my gosh, if I have an or an ah, or I stumble over a word, that it's going to be, the end all. Doesn't have to be. No, well, one, you can edit it out, certainly. Uh, you heard me say and I say it. I mean, we all do. So don't worry about that. Again, it's not a performance, it's a conversation. And I find that a lot of times just changing that frame of reference can be a game changer to those of you who are really nervous about this going before the microphone.
I think one, don't take ums and uhs out of yours or other people's speech unless it's distracting to listening. And that typically happens in the early stages of podcasting where you'll have ums and uhs every word until you get comfortable. That's fine.
And
Go
there's a
ahead.
lot of crutch words too, like no,
I use basically all the time as
yes.
my filler word, and it takes time to work yourself out of those, and sometimes you pick them up along the way, and then all of a sudden they get stuck. That's just habitual stuff. Don't get so worried about that. I think that it becomes disingenuous when all of a sudden you've removed all of those things and now it sounds like it was scripted when it was actually a conversation. And it doesn't sound as authentic, I think, when I listen to podcasters who have taken out every little, wrong thing. And I did this myself. I definitely did this myself in early podcasts where I took out every possible error until it was absolutely pristine. And unfortunately, it didn't do any good. Like, it didn't provide me any more value. And if I'm a business owner and I want to have value, then I want there to be a level of authenticity built into that. So understand that authenticity is a value that you want to have in your podcast. So if it's not conflicting with the value that you're providing in the content, then don't remove it. And I think you're right that over time, the nerves start to settle, you get more comfortable. I always like the idea of turning on the recording a few minutes before you actually start, so that that little red light or whatever showing you that it's recording becomes dulled in your mind's eye or in your actual visual, field, so that it kind of just goes away. And that's also the case for guests, for a co-host. I will frequently say, "Let's start recording now." 5 minutes, maybe even sometimes 15 minutes before we start the real show, and that way they've been being recorded. So all of that cortisol kind of empties out. They have a chance to filter it out of their system, and now they can bring their normal self to the recording, and that becomes a little bit nicer segue.
Yeah, there's the joke also that, people fear public speaking more than they fear death. I think it was a Seinfeld joke and there's actually some studies about that too,
Yeah,
believe it
it's
or
that
not.
they'd rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy.
Yes, yes. So when I say, think of it as a conversation, that does help calm people. The other part that I think that people have that feeling that, oh my God, I'm an imposter, the imposter syndrome, that self-doubt that folks have. Uh, remember, how to get over that is remember that you're the expert. You're the thought leader. If it's your podcast, you are the thought leader that is hosting this podcast. Yes, you're going to have other thought leaders on, but it's you're the business person. You know your business. So don't let that creep into your thinking. And I wanted to get back to the nerves aspect of it for a moment. Okay, so, the challenge is how do you overcome those nerves? Many, you may have heard this before, some people strike that Superman pose or Superwoman pose. Some of you may want to exercise beforehand to kind of relax. There are ways to do that as well. There basically whatever can work for you to help calm you down, do it. I would not recommend alcohol, so stay away from that. But, something physical or again, something again, changing that frame of reference to conversation versus performance, and use the nerves that you have as positive energy, not negative energy. Embrace those nerves and realize that they are normal, whether you're speaking on a stage in front of 1,000 people or you're taping a podcast episode, whether it's live or just on tape. And that tends to people think about that, many of my clients think about that. I would highly recommend that to you.
Yeah, so all the negative physiological emotions that you feel when in fight or flight are the same ones you feel physiologically when you're excited and
Mhm.
when you're engaged in something that's really joyful. So, just changing your perspective and on what you're feeling slowly but surely will help to retrain you in a lot of that. There's actually some new research out there on imposter syndrome and really helps outline for people how incredibly positive it is to have imposter syndrome. It tells us a lot about ourselves, and it's a good sign that you're feeling that level of imposter syndrome, and to lean into continuing to do, not letting it hold you back. And so, I'll put a link to that in the show notes once we release this. I think it'll be really good for folks to kind of take hold, take heart to that idea that imposter syndrome is not a bad thing in the way in which we tend to feel like it is. Where do you want to go from here, Steve?
So we've kind of touched on the personal aspects of some of the challenges that we face as a podcast host, but what about the format specific challenges that you might face? So why don't we get into that a little bit, Ray?
Sure. So, when you are solo, I have been a solo host for many, many of my podcasts, and I don't have this problem. But
You're just
uh,
perfect, Ray. See, Ray doesn't have to worry about perfection because he is perfection.
no, not hardly, hardly, hardly. But I do enjoy. So I have a wonderful interior world, and I highly recommend this to others, which is that if you can have a wonderful interior world, then podcast recording solo is a wonderful journey because you're just sharing your interior world with others. And I don't know how to pass that along to someone else, but I will say that some of the things that do help is what we've already talked about. Envision someone you um, just enjoy talking to. And you know that person, right? You have that friend where you pick up the phone after a few years and it's like you never stopped talking to them. Or if it's a spouse or a partner that you love and enjoy, they're not just your lover, but they're also your friend. That's a person that you can envision when you're talking on the mic to. Think about your best possible customer, the customer that walks in the door and just lights up the room, and you have a great conversation with them. And they always have curious questions for you, and they're graceful and compassionate and understanding in the face of challenges and working with them. All of those kinds of people are people that you should envision when you're solo on the mic, because it's just going to get you to bring more of you out in that sense. And so that's where I would start with regard to maybe that solo show where the format may be an obstacle because you don't have that interplay. You don't have someone who's going to play off of with you.
Playing off of that, from a structural standpoint, from a solo host situation, from the structural standpoint, I think one of the keys is, do you script it all? Do you script your intro and outro, have bullet points, key phrases? How do you set that up as a solo host? And basically, from what I understand from you, Ray, is you would not script, and it's kind of a because you have that inner world going on inside, or that you're just it's coming out, you've got your bullet points, maybe you have a key phrase and you know it inside and out, and you can follow that logically. So How do you do it? Or do you, I know in the book, I will say in the book, we recommend kind of a hybrid approach,
Mhm.
but how do you approach it? And how
Yeah,
would you
so
recommend others approach it?
it depends on the content that you're trying to share. So in the past, my first podcast was scripted. Every word was scripted, and then I when I so it was supposed to be a 2-minute podcast, and so I had to then sit with the podcast that I scripted and then cut it until the audio shrunk down to under 2 minutes. And so that was fully scripted, and it because of the format, again, the format being solo with a time restriction, I had to script it. I couldn't just do that extemporaneously. For all of the other podcasts over my entire career, they have been extemporaneous conversation with others, or they've been me talking behind the mic, again, outline and extemporaneously. I am going to be doing a podcast soon that will be scripted. And that will be because it's not every episode, but because they're more essay like podcast episodes, but they're essays that I want to say to people, right? It's something that I don't want an auto-generated, tool to be listening to. I want to be able to put my own inflection, for it to be my own prosody. I want it to be my voice talking about these things because there is value in what I feel like I'm saying the way I'm saying it. And it's also a narrative type of podcast. And so I don't know. I just feel like that needs to be scripted and it
Mhm.
needs to be my voice. And so, other than those two examples where I have a pretty tight restrictions on the way I'm doing them, I think just generally it saves a lot of time not to script a podcast. And again, this if you were doing a narrative fiction podcast, of course you would script that. And of
Script,
course you
script,
would, you know what I mean?
script.
Like, yeah,
Yes.
but that's not what this is. I mean, for most business owners, the reason why we don't really recommend that in the book is because it's unnecessary, right? You're going to be able to bring to the table your expertise, your experience with working with these particular groups of folks, having conversations with people that you know or you're getting to know in a space that you know. And so why script any of that? It's just going to become cumbersome for you to not go with the flow in the conversation or in leading people down the journey that you are in the parasocial relationship side, right? Scripted podcasts are not great for parasocial relationship development. If you ever walked into a cocktail party and someone had a script in front of them and read off of the script to you, "Hi, my name is Raymond. What's your name?" It would be weird, right? And we know that intuitively, but for some reason we feel like that is going to just happen naturally in a podcast when we're reading. When we're reading off of a piece of paper, it takes a lot, or even off a screen. It takes a lot for us to read and convey that natural, flow, along with a natural sense that we're bringing our authentic selves to the microphone. So I feel like it puts distance, and I don't think it's necessary for every podcast.
And that raises an extremely interesting point that I have this conversation time and time again with folks. I've had it this week with some folks that had nothing to do with clients, just friends of mine. We were having this conversation, and I work with a lot of authors, and a lot of authors are writing for the page, and then they are going to be guests on podcasts. So what is the language that you should be using when you're going to be guesting on a podcast? Is it the language that you write on the page, or is it the language for how you speak? And those are two very different things. And I have this conversation quite often. You write for the page, you you write for the ear rather, excuse me, you write for the ear rather than for the page. Anything that you have to do when it's a podcast or even a presentation, you're writing for the ear. If you're writing, if it's the language that, let's say, it's not scripted, always think of, the kind of complicated language that you might have on a page or during a meeting with your peers, or it's jargon or it's a complex term. Never just use that phrase. If you have to use that phrase, make sure you explain it in language that people will understand because they're not seeing it on the page, they're listening to it.
And I
And
think
that's a
there's a
big distinction.
yeah, and I want to put a finer point on this, which is that, you come from radio, and I think that it's really important for people to recognize that radio and television are meant for sound bites. And podcasting naturally lends itself to longer form audio. And so the soundbite concept does not work as well. So you have to know that if you're being I know we're talking about hosting, but you still want to have those kinds of quotable, clippable statements from you as a host, and so you want to make sure that as you are making outlining for an episode, that you are preparing yourself for those moments where you're going to be just a little bit more cogent, a little bit more structured in the words that you're going to say, because you know that's going to be something that someone's going to clip and share as a YouTube clip or clip as a podcast clip and share that with other people. And so when you have those important brand messages to share, really do prepare and practice those. So, this is not a
Mhm.
this is not a hard and fast never do this thing, right? There are moments to do it. And then there are going to be other times when if you're preparing for TV, radio, or other kinds of live media where they just want snippets of, soundbite type content, then making sure that you really have practiced that differently. And I know that Steve works with folks for that as well, but I don't lend well to television or radio because I'm like, wait, you only want to talk for 2 minutes? How about 2 hours? And then we will get the
Yeah, we differ dramatically on this because I will tell folks, well, I know we're veering off into guests, but we can veer off to guests for a while. I like to say you don't need to go more than 30 to 90 seconds when you answer a question. And invariably, they'll want to go 5 minutes. And I will always say, you are having a focused conversation, not a monologue. This isn't a presentation because there is the belief that it is a presentation interrupted by questions. And again, I'll talk about, the frame of reference. So that's a completely different frame of reference than you're having a focused conversation with somebody. You're thinking differently. Now, also, let me also say that yes, as a host, you want to have those clippable moments, and you can have those clippable moments by short, punchy statements, sentences, make them colorful, same as you would as a guest. And we're going to talk about guesting on a podcast in a later episode, so we'll get more in depth about that. But think about that. And even as a guest, you can have those short, punchy statements. And when you think about the Oscars and you have those quips after somebody comes up and talks, let's say that somebody gives a funny acceptance speech or whatever it is, or a poor acceptance speech, and the host comes on and has a joke. Those are all prepared. So you can prepare maybe 10 sentences that that you want to have clips of along the way, even as a host or a guest. And that's all, again, part of the preparation part that we talk about.
All right. Talking about jokes, how about the advice you give about not having certain types of jokes?
Well, it's not only not having certain types of jokes. You know how you'll listen to a podcast and there are inside jokes between the hosts or the host and the guest, perhaps if they're friends, or they'll start off a podcast with a story that has nothing to do about the audience or that what the audience would care about. They'll talk about, oh, how are you doing? Oh, I'm doing great. The weather here in Houston is, oh, we're having a heat wave. No, we don't need any of that. We don't need any inside jokes. Yes, you could joke around because we have joked around, but it's how you joke and what you joke about. Think about that.
I will say that if I start a new podcast and they get into a bunch of jargon or a bunch of inside jokes that I'm not aware of, and they go on for too long before they get into the kind of meat of whatever that might be. Many times these are comedy podcasts as well, which really irritates me more. But the audience is lost, right? I leave those podcasts. I just abandon them because I figure they're never going to quite explain to me what the inside joke is. And the only way for me to learn it is to go back and listen to everything from the beginning. And that's not going to happen. I've only done that with two podcasts in my day. And I know that I mean, in my own podcasts, I literally get messages from people who tell me, "Hey, I'm going to listen to your entire catalog of this podcast. I'm going on road trip. I'm going on a trip, and I have lots of time. I'm going to listen to all of them." I say, God bless. Uh, God bless and Godspeed to listen to me for that many hours. And just my prod pod episodes, I think is a good chunk of dozens of hours. And then think of all of the other 45 to 60-minute podcasts in the hundreds of episodes that I've recorded over the years. And but good on them. They want to listen to it from the
Mhm.
from the beginning, and that's great. But it's very unlikely for me to do that when you have a 3 or 4 hour podcast and somewhere buried in there is an inside joke and you just keep going on it. It's annoying to the person who's left out. And if your goal is to create a power social relationship, you're supposed to bring more people in. You're supposed to be as inclusive as possible. So this is one, don't do the inside joke, or make sure that you're explaining it. If you have a co-host, presumably if you're interviewing a guest, you're not going to do an inside joke for that one time and not explain it. Go ahead and explain it, but it kind of is silly to do that. But if you have a co-host and you are going to do an inside joke, you're going to have to explain it to the audience. Maybe not every time, but certainly at least every couple of times, so that you get the audience in on the joke, right? That's the whole point, is to now it's about getting that group of people to feel like they're in the in group, not in the out group. So there's probably a way to do it. I think Steve's general rule, which is like just don't do inside jokes, is probably a good one to follow, unless you're going to explain the inside joke for future use. Which again, cult language is important in building a community. So cult language is not bad. Cults may be
That's a
bad,
different yeah, that's a whole different
but cult
animal.
language, right? A shared set of terminology that you use, right? Naming yourselves, some kind of demonym that you use for the in group, right? So like I run a personal productivity online community, and so we're personal productivity enthusiasts, and so we could have our own name for ourselves, right? And there are ways in which you can use all of the language around time management and different methodologies, right? Some people call themselves GTDers for using the getting things done methodology, right? That's cult language. That's how we identify with our in group. And if you're not a GTDer, you're in the out group, and that builds that kind of relationship. So there's nothing wrong with doing it. It's just doing it in the right ways that doesn't alienate people, so that they don't feel like they're going to be sitting there listening to stuff that just doesn't make sense to them.
Well, and again, I want to also make clear that it's not just inside jokes. It's all that introductory language that "Oh, how are you? I'm fine. How are you doing? What's up with you? Oh, I went to the grocery store the other day and I ran into blah, blah, blah." Those kinds of things that just waste a listener's time. And you may, if you're taping your podcast, if you want to do that because you haven't talked to your co-host in a while, or whatever it is, just edit it out and start with the meat. I'd like to think that we've started with the meat. Okay, yeah, hi, my co-host is Steve Orr. Hey, okay, let's go. Um, that was kind of what I'm hoping that we have done, so that
And
we're
again,
not wasting listeners' time.
right, and this contrasts with, again, a hobby podcast, a passion podcast. I can
Different.
very much see that being totally cool, and, like, people there are people who listen to podcasts as their companionship, as their social outlet, so there's nothing wrong with doing it. It's doing it in this
This,
context
yes,
that
yes.
he was talking about. And I think that, it just can't be underscored enough how important it is for you to really think about the fact that this is just a different kind of podcasting. And you need to really think about people's time as valuable. And you're providing voice and value as we talk about in the book. And that also means understanding the value you're taking of other people's time in that process. So totally hear you there. Well, let's close this section out with talking about you talk about focus and flow, and you're using terms that I use in my productivity world. So
Ooh.
you've gotten me excited about focus and flow. But yeah, talk to us about some of those pieces, and then we'll close out this segment and close out with our final segment.
So we can do this very quickly. One of the formats that we do talk about, if you are a small business owner, there's the solo host. We've alluded to that. Co-host. We've alluded to that. You're the host with guests. But there's also another component that is a potential format for folks, and that is a live call-in show. That's very popular in radio, but you can do it in podcasting as well. You can get, your callers don't have to be physical callers. Many social media channels now that you can do that through and ask your questions. I know all the technical aspects of this better than I do, but in terms of focus and flow, it's the focus of you as a host. The focus really, you're kind of a traffic cop, because not only are you focused on the conversation, but you have to be focused on the flow of guests. How much time do you give to a guest? Making sure that they're adding to the conversation. Are they engaging? Are they adding to the discussion? How do you know when to get rid of them if
Yeah,
need be?
yeah.
Shut them off. Um, there's a lot of unpredictability with this kind of format. So that's the focus part. The flow is, you know, again, how long do you let them go? How often are you going to accept calls? The flow of, okay, this caller is going to go for a minute or two, then I'm going to talk for another minute or two about what that caller said, give my rebuttal if it's a rebuttal, or add to what that person said, and the flow of when should the next caller come in. How do you balance all of that? So
Right.
those are and again, you're kind of like a traffic cop, except
So
with callers.
yeah, so this is something that we don't cover in the book, just because we didn't have the time to really dwell on this, but it's something that I talk about in the classes that I teach on this, which is that when you are dealing with this as a business owner, one, you don't have to respond to anything you don't want to respond to. And so, for example, we're live right now. In this recording, folks can come in and ask any question they want to in the chat. Do Steve and I need to respond to any of them? No. Right? So there's zero responsibility to respond to them. Now, is it gauche to not respond to them? In some cases, yes. But there are times when every business owner needs to recognize that you're going to have somebody who flares. And so folks maybe who don't know internet kind of language or lingo, flaring is when someone just starts writing very angry messages, and they are just, at that point where they have hit an emotional peak and they're just flaring, as they call it, just kind of like a solar flare. And then there's chatter. Chatter is just indistinguishable conversation from value. So there's valuable conversation, and then there's just chatter. And think of it as kind of background radiation or background noise out there in the cosmos. And so you can ignore chatter, and you can also ignore flaring. And so if someone just comes out and they ask you really inappropriate questions, or they are just angry at you, maybe they're a past customer and they live call in and they want to just go at it, you can just politely end the call and continue on with the show. Do not get flustered. And I know it will happen. You will get flustered, but try as best as you can not to get flustered by these folks, right? You're not going to be able to make a couple omelets without breaking a whole lot of eggs. And so, that's just going to be the nature of any business. People are going to have unpopular opinions. You may have unpopular opinions, and people are going to respond to those. Humans are emotional creatures, and so just learn to ignore the questions you don't need to answer, and learn to flow through these kinds of situations. So I see a lot of people who visually respond to things. And when you're an audio podcast, that's not usually as much of an issue, but because a lot of podcasts are now on video as well, even if they're just using the audio for the podcast feed, like us, it's still going to be on YouTube. And so, you're going to see the facial expressions. So learn to control those. You want to basically not like, deer caught in the headlights kind of look if what they're saying is not true or is just kind of silly stuff, right? Many of the tools also allow you to delete things that are inappropriate, especially if there is CSAM, which is child pornography, those kinds of things. You just want to get rid of them immediately if you're in an environment where that is possible. Just want to obviously protect the business and the other viewers who might be live on the call with you. Some people do it in Zoom, and there can be Zoom bombing, and there's all kinds of silliness that can happen in those kinds of live shows. But that's the unpredictability piece. But I will say, Steve, I think the unpredictability of podcasting is what keeps people on the edge of their seat
Oh,
listening.
yeah. Well, that can be too. But, in talking about that unpredictability, we do talk about a call-in live show. We do also suggest that if you are going to go this route, to hire somebody in radio parlance term, call screener or producer, so that they can handle all that other stuff to make sure that for lack of a better term, the caller, whether it's a real call and you set up your equipment that you can accept a real call, or it's through a social media channel and they ask questions, that they kind of sift through that or have a conversation with a caller, physical caller, to know that it's going to be germane to the conversation, to kind of, for lack of a better term, screen out those who might be, go down a road that would be detrimental to your show.
Yeah, but even if you do that, Steve, right? I can get on the
Oh,
line.
yeah, of course, yes, and say, "I'm gonna talk about this," and then ask a completely different question. Of course. Of
So I
course
think
that can happen.
every business owner who wants to do a live show needs to be prepared for those kinds of situations. So just know you need to prepare for the unpredictability, and you need to be able to learn to just cut people off and just say like, this is no longer helpful. Say it in other words, but basically, however you feel most confidently saying that. For me, it's usually okay. Well, we've reached the end of this particular topic, and let's move on, right? So, and then I'm just going to mute that person, put them off to the side, and move on with the conversation. You will learn your own ways to do that without alienating people, but just moving on with the conversation.
And let me just also say, I know we talk about a live call-in show. We also do talk about live shows, just live shows, whether it's at your business, you bring a live show elsewhere. I think we're going to talk more about that going forward, but just know that those are other ways to do a live show with an audience participation.
Right. And the rule of thumb there is never hand a microphone to an audience member.
Mm-mm.
Have someone hold that microphone. Every time I see someone go out into an audience with a microphone, I'm always like, do not give it to them. Do not give
Oh,
it
they're
to them.
always going to want to grab. Yeah, somebody's always going to want to grab that mic. As a reporter, I knew that. Hold on to my microphone.
But people don't. People
Oh, I know.
don't.
I know.
And most of the time, if you're on stage and you're the host, as a business owner, you're the host. You're on stage. Someone else is handing that mic out there, or maybe you have the mic on a mic stand, standing out in the audience, and people are walking up to it. Then you need to basically have the ability to mute that mic to move on. And so, just it seems such like simple things, but they are really, really important to make sure that you continue to keep flow of the show and keep command of the audience. The last thing you want is someone to go off on, some kind of mental emotional tirade when you are just trying to have an entertaining night with folks and inform them and record your podcast. So just be mindful. Being able to mute a microphone is really important and powerful, and never give up control of the mic. Always control that microphone. Don't hand it to somebody. And that means training your staff or whoever's working that the guest mic out in the audience to keep hold of it. Because once you give it away to somebody, they can do whatever they want. and it
True.
becomes a all right, let's move on to segment three. We're going to have to rush through this a little bit, Steve, because we are running out of time. But let's tackle some things that you can do with reflect, learn, and listen to grow as a podcast host.
The biggest when it comes to reflect is just know your personality, give some real thought to your personality. With learn, make sure you are fully on board knowing what you want your episodes to be about and do as much research as possible to know that you are as prepared as possible for that particular episode. That goes for you as the host, and learn as much as you can about your guest. And there are many ways to do that, whether it's their LinkedIn profile, whether they've written an article, whether they've spoken on other podcasts, news interviews, whatever it is, do your research. Listen, very simply, listen and don't rely on a list of your questions if it's an interview podcast.
Great. And how do people choose the right format for their podcast? Going back to kind of the reflect and learn piece.
I think it really just is understand your strengths and your goals of the show. And that's another piece we haven't talked about much, but
Mhm.
those two go hand in hand. If you're not a great speaker and the goal of your show is you want to, and obviously the goal is probably to get as many clients hopefully as you can going forward, but give them value and understand that you're giving them value, the audience value, then maybe knowing that your strength is not as a solo host, maybe that means, okay, so I'm going to have a co-host with me, or I'm going to interview others, but just understand your strengths.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that people frequently lose sight of is that a show's format may change over time, but there should be some level of consistency there. And so, like with Web and Beyond Cast, for example, it is multimodal, right? So I'm going to
Mhm.
have episodes where I grab the audio from a recent webinar and I use that as an episode. I'll have episodes where I speak solo and episodes where I'm interviewing guests. And since I'm the host and I don't have a co-host on that show, I kind of am picking and choosing what content and the best way to kind of present that content. And so it's just one of those things. Now, people know to expect that from me. So they're going to know that, every couple of episodes is going to be a solo show, and every couple of episodes is going to be, the audio, ripping the audio from a webinar, and so on and so forth, and go from there. And so like just choosing the right format doesn't have to be a cookie cutter kind of thing. But as Steve talked about, it's about what is the value you are providing to your audience, and what's the best way to provide that value. And so if I feel like, okay, I did this webinar but it really required a lot of visuals, and so it's not going to be best to put into the audio feed, so I'm going to record a new episode talking about that topic, and that way I can describe the visuals to people so that even if they are never going to see the webinar, they're still going to get the value out of it. Then I'm going to do it that way. And so you kind of have to flow with some of these things, and understanding what your audience is looking for, how you best are going to be able to create that content. And I'm always looking for the most efficient way to just like get it out there. And that's not always the most necessarily refined perspective when it comes to the arc of an editorial calendar or otherwise. But it's about getting the most and best information in front of small business owners. For me, that's my value statement. That doesn't necessarily have to be yours. So just figure out what the value is you're trying to provide, and then provide that to the audience in the way they want it.
So I'll have one final remark here too. It's not about hosting isn't about being perfect. It's about finding what works for you. You show up prepared and you keep your audience front and center. And if you do all of that, I do believe that you will have a successful podcast.
Fantastic way to end our show today, Steve. We are going to be talking about how to generate content in our next episode. This is another kind of piece that Steve spent a lot of time working on. So Steve's going to lead that discussion mostly next week as well. And so we will see you all next time here on Podcasting for Small Business, our companion podcast series to Podcasting for Small Business, the essential blueprint to launch your podcast by Steve and myself. And so, with that, take care, everybody. We look forward to hearing the podcasts you put together. We'll talk to you next week.